Talia said it the way someone might flick lint off a shirt they didn't even like. A tiny push of her hand, a narrowing of her eyes, and then those memorable, spectacularly unnecessary words. Don't touch me. I respect myself. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. The hall light flickered above us, which felt about right for the moment. That bulb had been threatening to go out for months, fluttering whenever someone opened the fridge or ran the dishwasher. I'd meant to replace it. I'd meant to fix a lot of things. But as I stood there in the dim half-shine while my wife looked at me like I was a stain on the rug, something shifted in my chest. Not a dramatic movie-style moment. Nothing with fanfare, just a quiet, clear rearranging of gears somewhere inside. Like a lock turning smoothly after years of rust. I didn't say anything. That surprised even me. Usually I tried to soothe her, tried to explain myself, tried to pretend whatever she said didn't land like a slap. But this time, the air felt different. Still. Heavy in a thoughtful way rather than a hostile one. She waited for me to apologize or plead or react. Something. Anything. When I didn't, she rolled her eyes, muttered something about my predictable silence, and marched away. I stood there a moment longer, letting the silence linger. Not as a weapon, not as a surrender, more like a small private victory. Then I turned off the light, or tried to. The switch made a sputtering sound and the bulb struggled before finally dimming out. Perfect. The next morning began in the usual way, Talia talking at me instead of to me. You forgot to confirm the catering for Brinley's event tonight, she said over her shoulder as she smeared jam on her toast. I didn't forget, I said. You changed the date 3 times and never told me the final version. She scoffed in the dramatic way she'd perfected. You should keep up. It's not that complicated. It wasn't complicated, just exhausting. The constant shifting of tasks. The way she loved to hand me errands like she was giving directions to a delivery driver. See, back when we met, she used words like partnership and equality. When we got married, she swapped those for convenience and assistance. The versions of me she preferred were the ones who nodded, obeyed, adjusted. The ones who saved her time, made her life easier, kept her calendar pristine. But the night before had left a mark. I didn't feel the usual urge to scramble or smooth anything out. I simply reached for my coffee. I can't do your errands today, I said calmly. Her hand froze midair, toast hovering like it had forgotten gravity. What? I've got 3 project proposals due and 2 client walkthroughs. I'm out all day. She stared at me, waiting for the punchline. When it didn't arrive, she lowered the toast slowly, narrowing her eyes. Are you in one of your moods? Not really. She sighed sharply, the sound slicing the room in half. Fine, I'll do it myself. She said it as though I'd abandoned her on the side of a highway rather than declining to email a caterer. But if she wanted realism, she should have considered how she'd spoken to me last night, like I was some creature she'd found accidentally touching her porch furniture. I grabbed my keys, drained the rest of my coffee, and headed out the door before she could gather enough steam to continue. At the office, I kept waiting for the familiar sting of guilt to show up, the one that usually hit me after any conflict with Talia. But it didn't. Instead, the quiet clarity from last night followed me like a shadow. Actually, not a shadow, more like a steadying hand between my shoulder blades. A reminder that I wasn't the unreasonable one here. Not this time. Maybe not any of the past dozen times either. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Talia again. I let it ring. She called back immediately, then again. Then she texted, "Did you seriously ignore my messages?" Another. "This is important. Pick up." And then, "Wow. You're really going to do this today of all days? When I needed your help most? Seriously?" I set the phone face down on the desk and focused on the blueprint in front of me, making a few revisions with a red pencil. The scratch of graphite on paper sounded clean, simple, manageable. A far cry from the chaotic crackle of tension Talia had learned to generate from almost nothing. My coworker, Vaughn, leaned over the divider. "Everything all right?" "Fine," I said. He raised a brow, the kind that says he didn't believe me but wasn't invested enough to ask more. "Clients coming in at 2. You good with the renderings?" "Yep." I wasn't just good with them, I was ahead for once. It was amazing what a person could accomplish when they weren't carrying a full schedule of someone else's demands on their shoulders. At the client meeting, I felt something else unusual. Confidence. Real, easy confidence. The kind I hadn't seen in myself for years. I had ideas. They landed well. My voice didn't shake. My thoughts didn't wander toward whatever Talia might be upset about. I was fully present, and functional, and calm. On the drive home, though, I braced myself. Usually after a day like that, missed calls, ignored messages, the evening became an uphill battle, sometimes an outright avalanche. The moment I stepped inside, I sensed the tension, her tension. It vibrated faintly through the air, invisible but unmistakable. She was in the kitchen, pacing. "You didn't answer me," she said, without looking up. "I needed you today, and you just vanished. You know what kind of day I had?" "Probably the same kind I had," I said gently. She finally looked at me. "Don't patronize me." "I'm not." "You are." I shrugged, not defiant, not mocking, just neutral. Her eyes widened as though neutrality were a personal offense. "What has gotten into you?" she demanded. "Nothing," I said, "just focusing on my work." She scoffed again. That sound was becoming a theme. "You can't just check out because you feel annoyed. That's not how a marriage works." It was rich hearing her talk about marriage maintenance like it was a team effort. For years, she'd shifted her responsibilities onto me. Appointments, bills, family favors, work errands, everything. Now she was upset because I didn't pick up the slack when she snapped at me the night before. "I didn't check out," I said. "I worked. You know, the job that pays our bills." "That's such an exaggeration," she said sharply. "I contribute plenty." "Okay." The word landed like a stone between us. It wasn't the response she wanted. She wanted the old version of me, the one who rushed to clarify, justify, absorb her frustration like some kind of emotional sponge. "So what? You're punishing me now?" she said. "No," I said. "Just taking care of my responsibilities, the ones that are actually mine." Her expression tightened. She crossed her arms and leaned against the counter, studying me like she was searching for cracks. "Is this about last night?" she asked. I let a beat pass. "Partly." She flinched very slightly, almost imperceptibly. "I was upset," she said. "You know how stressed I've been." "I do," I said. "But the way you spoke to me wasn't stress. It was something else." She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in a long time, she didn't seem to have a ready-made explanation. Her hands dropped to her sides. "I didn't mean it," she said finally. "I was overwhelmed." That might have mattered if it had been an isolated moment, but the truth was, she'd been pushing me away, not physically, but emotionally, verbally, habitually, for months, maybe years, like I was something she could reorder, reassign, reschedule whenever she pleased. "I know," I said, "but we should probably talk about a few things." "Like what?" "Finances," I said. "Schedules, responsibilities, all the things you've assumed I would handle alone." Her suspenseful silence was telling. "Are you serious?" "Yes." She let out a strained laugh. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being practical." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her face said everything, She hated this new version of me, the version that wasn't immediately malleable, the version that didn't rush to soothe her. After a moment, she tried another angle. Noah, you know I depend on you. I know, I said, and I've let that become unfair. There was a longer silence this time, a thicker one. Then she spoke in a voice that was quieter, but not softer. If you're trying to send a message, she said, I'm hearing it. She walked past me without another word. Her heels clicked down the hall, each step crisp, deliberate. Something told me this conversation wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, she didn't speak to me. Not a word. She moved around the kitchen with the choreography of someone performing calm while seething under the surface. It didn't bother me the way it might have before. Actually, it simplified things. At work, though, I got a call from my cousin Joel. He never called unless he needed something. Hey, he said when I picked up. Heard you and Talia had a rough night? I paused. From who? Lynn, he said casually. My sister, of course. She said you two were arguing, he continued. She's worried. They weren't worried about me. They never were. They were worried about losing access to favors, to the free project advice, to the occasional home repair I did when they asked. We're fine, I said. You don't sound fine. I didn't ask for analysis. He chuckled in that harmless but irritating way he had. Look, I'm just saying, you can't ignore your wife. It's not good. She ignored me for months, I said calmly. No one called to check on me then. He paused. Well, that's different. How? It just is. I've got work, Joel. If you don't need anything, I should go. He hesitated. Actually, could you swing by later? The railing on my porch is loose. There it was. I can't, I said. Busy. He fell silent for a beat longer than polite. All right, he said finally. Talk later. He hung up with a tone that suggested I'd broken some unspoken contract. Maybe I had, but I hadn't agreed to it in the first place. When I got home that night, Talia stood in the living room waiting for me. She looked tired, but in a performative way, like she wanted me to see the exhaustion and feel something. Guilt, probably. We need to talk, she said. Okay, I replied, setting my bag down. What's going on with you? She asked. You're distant, you're cold, and you're making everything harder. I'm acting the way you've acted toward me for a long time, I said. You don't like it. She blinked. That one hit home. I never treated you the way you're treating me now, she said. You did, I said. Maybe you didn't notice. She opened her mouth, closed it, took a step toward me, then stopped as if remembering something. I waited. She took a breath. Look, she said. I said something harsh the other night. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. It was a rare apology, but I didn't chase it with reassurances. I didn't soften it with a joke. I simply nodded. Okay, I said. She frowned slightly. Okay? Yes. She stared at me like I'd missed my cue entirely. So that's it? You're not even going to talk to me about it? We can talk, I said, but things need to change. Her jaw tightened. You sound like you're issuing commands. I'm making boundaries, I corrected. She looked unsettled. She wasn't used to me holding a line. She was used to me bending until I nearly folded. I don't want things to change, she said quietly. I just want us to go back to normal. Normal wasn't fair, I replied. She let out another strained noise, not quite a sigh, not quite a groan. You're really doing this, she said. I am. And if I refuse? Then we keep having the same argument forever. She swallowed hard. Then she walked to the window, looked out for a moment and said, I don't know how to handle this version of you. It's still me, I said. Just me without the part that tries to control how you feel by erasing how I do. She didn't respond. She just kept looking out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. That night, I lay awake thinking about how simple everything looked from here. Not easy, just simple. A series of cause and effect steps that had been building for years. Ones I hadn't noticed because I'd been too busy trying to hold everything together. But now, something had shifted. A balance had tipped. The quiet clarity had returned, settling over me like a steadying blanket. The next morning, I opened the shared account spreadsheet. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel nervous. I felt purposeful. Something told me I was just getting started. The morning after I opened the shared spreadsheet, something subtle shifted. So subtle I almost missed it. The quiet in the kitchen didn't feel like the usual tension. It felt more like the pause between two gears clicking into place. Talia stood at the counter, slicing an apple with unnecessary precision, each cut sharp enough to express whatever she wasn't saying out loud. She didn't look up when I entered, but her shoulders tightened just slightly, like she was bracing for impact. I poured coffee, letting the steam warm my hands while she continued slicing like it was a competitive sport. "You updated the accounts," she said finally, without turning around. I did. A slice stopped midair. "You didn't ask me." "I didn't need to. It's a shared account." She set the knife down, gently, but with the noticeable care of someone trying very hard not to look rattled. "You reorganized everything, all the expenses, all the bills." "Yes. I didn't approve that." "It's not something that requires approval. It's transparency." That word hit her. She stiffened, then slowly pivoted toward me, arms crossed. "You've never cared about any of that. You just handled things." "I know," I said. "And that's the problem. So now you're a financial expert?" "I'm an adult managing shared finances." She let out a shallow laugh. "Oh, come on, you're being theatrical." I sipped my coffee. "I'm being practical." She stared at me for a long moment, eyes narrowing as if she was trying to identify which part of me had changed shape. "You're acting like I've done something wrong." "You've taken advantage of the fact that I do everything," I said calmly. "And when I stopped, you got angry." "I didn't get angry." "You got angry," I repeated. Her lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't argue. That was new. "There was something else," she said after a pause. "My credit card bill came due. You didn't pay it." "I didn't," I said, "because it's yours." Her breath caught so softly I almost missed it. "You've always taken care of that. And that's how we ended up with thousands in hidden debt." Her cheeks flushed. "It wasn't hidden. It wasn't visible either," I said. "And that's the point." Her jaw flexed. "I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe you're choosing now to pick some kind of independence crusade." "It's not a crusade," I said. "It's balance." She didn't like that word either. Her fingers curled against her arms, nails tapping lightly against skin, as if searching for something to anchor onto. "I have a full schedule today," she muttered. "I don't have time for spreadsheets and whatever mood this is." "Mood," I repeated. "Interesting word." She shot me a look. "Don't twist what I'm saying." "I'm not," I said evenly. "I'm just noticing how you frame things." She waved a hand dismissively. "I knew it. You're trying to punish me." "Still no." She inhaled sharply, pulling in air like she was trying to reclaim control of the room. "Fine," she said. "If you want to have some big discussion about responsibility, let's do it tonight, after I get through the 100 things I have to manage without help." "All right," I said. "Tonight." She seemed surprised I agreed so easily. Maybe she thought I'd back down, or that I'd over-explain myself into exhaustion like I used to. But I just took another sip of coffee. As I grabbed my keys and headed out, she called after me. "You ignored my messages yesterday." "I was working." "That's never stopped you before," she snapped. It didn't need to, I said. Until now. She made a frustrated sound, a soft, compressed exhale. But by the time she thought of a retort, I'd already closed the door. My commute felt lighter than it had in months. There was no internal scramble, no rehearsing conversations, no holding the steering wheel with that subtle tension in my fingers before walking into another day of being pulled in 6 directions. At the office, my co-worker Vaughn raised an eyebrow when I walked in early for once. "You're in a good mood," he said. "I'm focused." "Focused," he repeated with a smirk. "That's your version of good mood." I shrugged, tossing my bag under the desk. "I'll take it." By 10, I'd already finished drafting a tricky redesign for a client whose taste shifted more often than the weather. By noon, I'd wrapped a call that usually drained me, but today felt easy. Something about removing Talia's constant demands from the background noise gave my brain more room to operate, more oxygen. Around 12:30, my phone buzzed. Talia again. I let it ring. She tried twice more, then sent messages. "I need you to pick up my dry cleaning. It closes at 4. Please don't ignore this. Also, I need you to drop off the documents for the event. They have to be there by 5. Why aren't you answering me?" I read them one by one, then locked my phone. My workday wasn't going to derail because she'd assigned me tasks she could easily do herself. I focused on my project until 3. That's when my sister, Lynn, called. I considered not answering, but the universe hates when I try to avoid trouble, so I picked up. "Hey," she said, sounding too cheerful to be casual. "What's going on with you two?" I closed my eyes briefly. "Who told you something is going on?" I talked to Talia. Of course she did. "She's worried," Lynn went on. "She said you've been distant, that you've been, what was the word? Uncooperative." "That's a nice spin," I said. "Is it true?" "Depends on your perspective." She sighed. "Noah, she says you're ignoring her." I was working. "You always manage both," she said. "You've always been reliable. What's different now?" I stopped taking responsibility for things that aren't mine. "That sounds petty." "It sounds balanced," I corrected. "You're being rigid," she insisted. "Marriage isn't a scorecard." "Agreed," I said. "That's why I stopped being the only one keeping track." My sister didn't reply immediately. I imagined her sitting in her car or her open house staging area, lips pursed, trying to decide whether she should support me or lecture me. She always leaned toward the latter. "Noah," she said finally, "you've changed. That's the idea." "Well, I don't like it." "That's not my responsibility." She gave an offended gasp. "Are you serious?" "Yes." "You're being difficult. Talia doesn't deserve this. She's overwhelmed." "She's been overwhelmed for 3 years," I said, "and I've been her solution." "And what's wrong with that?" she asked. I let out a slow breath. I didn't agree to be her everything. "If you don't want to help her, then who will?" she challenged. "Talia will help herself." "That's unreasonable," Lynn said sharply. I paused, letting the irony settle between us. "You don't hear yourself, do you?" "Noah, I've got a meeting," I said. "We can talk later." I hung up without waiting for permission. Another boundary nudged into place. The meeting ended early, and I left the office with a strange sense of satisfaction. Not triumph, not spite, just the steady, grounded kind of satisfaction that comes from finally telling the truth out loud. When I pulled into the driveway, Talia's car wasn't there. A delightful surprise. I suspected she'd be home soon, though. The kind of dramatic, confrontational energy in her messages suggested she was building momentum. I headed inside, loosened my tie, and started prepping for the talk she'd demanded. Not because I wanted a fight, but because I finally had clarity. I knew what I needed, what I wouldn't compromise on. At 5:30, I heard her car, then the door, then the pointed footsteps of someone who came home with a thesis to present. She marched in holding a dry cleaning bag in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. "You said you'd talk tonight," she announced. She didn't say hello. "I did," I said, taking a seat on the couch. She didn't sit. She planted herself in front of me like a prosecutor ready to list exhibits. "So," she said, "what exactly is this new system you're imposing? Because I'm getting a very controlling vibe from you." The irony almost made me laugh. "It's not a system," I said. "It's a quality." "This again," she muttered, tossing the papers onto the coffee table. "Noah, you're taking this too far." "By asking you to do your share?" "We've always had our roles," she insisted. "Yes," I said. "I worked. I managed everything. I bent schedules to make your life easier. And you gave me more to handle." "I never asked for all that," she snapped. "You didn't need to," I said calmly. "You implied it, expected it, and I let it happen." She shook her head in disbelief. "You're twisting this. You're making it sound like I'm lazy." "I'm making it sound like I'm tired," I said, "of running everything for two people." She blinked, but her expression didn't soften. "If you're unhappy, you should have said something sooner." "I tried," I said. "You didn't hear me." "I hear you now," she said tightly. "So what do you want?" "I want division of responsibilities. I want transparency in finances. I want respect." She hesitated. "From me?" "Yes, but I do respect you." I tilted my head. "Then say again what you said the other night." Her eyes widened. "No." "Exactly." Her hands clenched at her sides. I was upset. "You were honest," I corrected. She swallowed hard. "You're punishing me for one moment." "That moment wasn't isolated," I said. "It was the clearest reflection of everything that came before it." She looked down at the floor, then back up at me. Her voice softened just slightly. "So what now?" "Now we divide responsibilities equally," I said. "And we stick to it." She exhaled slowly. "So you're serious?" "I am." "And if I say no?" "Then we have a bigger problem." Her lips parted, but before she could speak, her phone buzzed. She checked it, frowned, then looked at me with fresh frustration. "My card got declined," she said. I nodded. "Because I didn't pay your bill." "You always pay my bill," she said through clenched teeth. "That was the old system," I said. She stared at me, face flushing. "You didn't even warn me." "I'm warning you now." She stepped forward like she was approaching a ledge. "I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe it took this long." Her hands trembled slightly. Barely noticeable. But there. She'd run out of explanations, out of tone shifts, out of ways to reroute blame. For the first time in years, she didn't know how to steer the narrative. "I feel like I don't recognize you," she whispered. "I recognize me," I said. "That hasn't happened in a long time." She sank onto the armchair, folding into herself, wrapping her arms around her torso. She looked smaller, not fragile, just unmoored. "I don't want this to fall apart," she said. "It doesn't have to," I said, "but something does." She nodded slowly, reluctantly. "Okay, fine. We'll try it your way." She didn't sound convinced. She sounded cornered. There was a difference. But for now, I let it stand. The night stayed quiet after that. She shut herself in her office. I went upstairs and reviewed the documentation I'd compiled. Notes from the therapist, expense records, screenshots of conversations and demands and schedules she'd rewritten at my expense. Not for battle, for clarity, for the eventual moment when clarity became necessary. At 10 o'clock, Talia came upstairs without a word. I stayed in the guest room. She didn't object. Lying there in the unfamiliar bed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt deliberate, focused, and strangely calm. She wanted to talk. She wanted resolutions. She wanted comfort. But I wanted reality. And reality had finally stepped into the room, set down its suitcase, and made itself comfortable. Tomorrow, I knew, would test both of us. She doesn't shift easily. Her reactions would escalate before they settle. And this time, I wasn't moving aside. I woke up before the alarm, which wasn't unusual, but the feeling I woke with was not dread, not resentment, something steadier, like I'd finally found the floor after months of sinking into soft, uneven ground. The house was quiet. Talia must have been awake already. She had a habit of tiptoeing around when she felt uncertain about her place in a room. I showered, dressed, and came downstairs to find her sitting at the kitchen island with a mug of tea she was turning in slow circles on the countertop. "You're up early," I said, grabbing a glass of water. She nodded without looking at me. "Couldn't sleep." She stirred the tea again, completely unnecessary. The bag had already been removed, then spoke in a voice that was too even to be natural. "I was thinking about our conversation." "Which part?" "All of it." I didn't answer right away. If I'd learned anything over the past few days, it was that silence worked better than conflict. Silence made her fill the gaps. Silence made her reveal things she normally hid behind sarcasm or quick dismissals. Finally, she spoke again. "I want to try. I do. But you need to meet me halfway. Halfway is exactly what I'm asking for." She flinched, just slightly. "So, what does that look like today?" "You do the things that are yours," I said. "I do mine." She didn't appreciate the simplicity of that. Her eyebrows drew together. "You're making this very transactional. I'm making it realistic." She pushed the mug away. "And what if I don't want our marriage to be a list of tasks?" "It already is," I said. "You just wrote most of the list and handed it to me." Her expression tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stood slowly, collected her purse, and said, "I guess I'll see you tonight." "See you tonight." She paused near the doorway, waiting, maybe for reassurance, maybe for an old pattern she could settle into. When none came, she left quietly. After she was gone, I sat at the table staring at the spreadsheet we'd stared at together the night before. Something about those rows, expenses, due dates, responsibilities, felt like an honest map of our marriage, a series of lines showing exactly where things had gone crooked. My phone buzzed, a message from my attorney confirming our next appointment. I marked the date in my calendar, not out of eagerness, not out of spite, just out of practicality. If things kept going in this direction, I wanted the groundwork ready. At work, everything felt strangely clear. I finished 3 revisions before lunch and didn't feel the usual weight sitting on my chest. When Vaughn walked by and saw how far ahead I was, he whistled. "Someone lit a fire under you." "Just focusing," I said. He nodded. "Whatever it is, keep it going." I intended to. Around 12:30, my phone buzzed, once, then twice, then several times in rapid succession. I ignored it until I finished a call with a client, then checked the notifications. They were from Talia. "Which grocery store do you want me to go to for tonight? You didn't update the meal plan. How am I supposed to know what to get? You can't leave me guessing. This isn't fair." I exhaled slowly. She was trying, in her own way, to follow the new system, but she wanted me to guide her through the process step by step, meaning she wasn't really letting go of the dynamic at all. I typed, "Buy whatever you think we need. Decide what you want to cook. I'll handle my own meals if necessary." 2 seconds later, "Are you serious?" "Yes." Another pause. This feels petty. I didn't respond. She needed to sit with the discomfort. For years, I'd swallowed mine just to keep the peace. Now, she had to learn how to navigate without constant support. It wasn't punishment, it was reality. Around 2 o'clock, my cousin Joel showed up at my office unannounced. He leaned on the doorway with the confidence of someone who assumes their presence is welcomed. "Busy?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He grinned like he didn't believe me and stepped inside anyway. "Look, I talked to Lynn. She said things are getting weird between you and Talia." I set my pen down. "What exactly did she tell you?" "That you've been acting strange, ignoring Talia, doing Spreadsheets. I didn't realize spreadsheets automatically meant personal crisis, I said. He huffed a laugh. Well, the way she described it, you're reorganizing the whole house. I'm organizing my boundaries. He blinked at me, then leaned back in the chair across from my desk. You know, she's worried. Lynn. She thinks you're having some kind of midlife shift. I'm making changes, I said, because the old system wasn't fair. That's marriage, he said with a shrug. Sometimes it's uneven. Uneven is one thing, I said. One-sided is another. He frowned. I think you're blowing this out of proportion. I took a quiet breath. You think that because the imbalance never affected you. He tilted his head. What's that supposed to mean? You've asked me for help with your place more times than I can count, I said evenly. Repairs, moves, late-night drives, and I always did it. Well, yeah, he said. That's what family does. Family also respects time, I said. Mine hasn't. He gave a humorless laugh. So you're keeping score now? No, I said. I'm not adding new tallies, I'm just not adding any more. He stared at me for a long moment, then stood abruptly. You're changing, man, and not in a good way. I didn't respond. He left without another word, muttering something under his breath as he went. The silence that followed felt cleaner than before. I drove home thinking about how quickly people react when a person stops being the convenient version of themselves. A version that accommodated, bent, softened, adjusted. The moment you stop, people notice, not because they care about your well-being, but because they miss the benefits. When I got home, Talia was already there. She stood in the kitchen surrounded by grocery bags, looking frazzled. You didn't respond, she said when she saw me. I didn't know what to get. You picked things, I said. That's enough. I picked random things, she said, exasperated. I don't even know what goes together. That's okay. It's not, she said. It matters. Why? She threw her hands up. Because now I'll probably screw up dinner or forget something or... Then order something, I said. Or make something simple. Or skip cooking. There's nothing catastrophic about any of those options. She stared at me like she didn't understand the language I was speaking. For years, she'd defined success by perfection, by polished presentation, by doing things exactly the way she curated in her head. The idea of imperfection wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unacceptable. I feel like you don't care, she said quietly. I care, I said, but not about grocery lists. That's not fair. It's honest. Her eyes flickered, but she said nothing else. She turned back to the groceries, and I watched her shoulders tighten with every can she set down. After a few minutes, she paused. Can we just have a normal night? Please? We can try. She nodded, relieved. For the next hour, she moved around the kitchen attempting dinner, fumbling more than usual. Not because the meal was complicated, but because she wasn't used to being uncertain. She'd built an image of herself as someone who didn't struggle with everyday tasks, someone efficient, someone composed. I let her navigate it alone. When dinner was ready, a slightly over-seasoned pasta dish, I complimented it genuinely. She softened just slightly, a small crack in the rigid facade she'd worn all day. We ate quietly. No arguments, no accusations. Just the faint, uneasy sense of two people relearning how to sit across from each other without resentment. Afterward, she looked at me with hesitant eyes. Can we talk now? Sure. She folded her hands. I don't want to keep fighting, she said. I don't like this version of us. I don't either, I admitted. But the old version wasn't working. She hesitated. I know I've been distant. I know I've been difficult. That's one word, I said. She gave a small, humorless laugh. Okay, more than difficult. I've been unfair. I nodded. Sometimes. She drew in a breath. I don't want you to pull away completely. I'm not pulling away, I said. I'm setting limits. Limits feel like walls. They're lines, I corrected. Not walls. She looked down, tapping her thumb against her palm, a nervous tick she only had when she felt cornered. What if things don't get better? She asked. Then we'll handle that too, I said. She nodded slowly. I'll try. I know. She studied my face carefully, as if looking for cracks. Then she said something unexpected. I'm scared. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because her fear wasn't something I needed to fix. Fear, like responsibility, was something she needed to learn how to carry on her own. She finally stood, cleared the plates, and disappeared upstairs. I stayed at the table, letting the quiet settle. Not heavy, not oppressive, just honest. An hour later, after she'd shut herself in our room, my phone buzzed. A message from my attorney. Documents reviewed. Next step, compiling evidence of pattern. Send anything relevant by end of week. I set the phone down without replying. Pattern. That was the word I'd avoided acknowledging for a long time. When I finally went upstairs, she was already in bed, turned away. I didn't join her. I grabbed a blanket, went to the guest room, and lay down. The ceiling above me had a faint crack running across it. Nothing structural, just cosmetic. Something I'd meant to fix a year ago but never found time for. I closed my eyes, letting the room settle around me. Talia wasn't the only one scared. But the difference was simple. I wasn't scared of change. I was scared of staying exactly where we'd been. And now that I'd moved even slightly, there was no going back. The morning after our uneasy truce began with the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. More like a waiting room silence, sterile, padded, and uncomfortable. Talia sat at the table scrolling through her phone while sipping tea. Every few seconds she'd glance at me as if checking whether I still existed in her preferred configuration. Are you going into the office today? She finally asked. Yes. I thought maybe we could talk this evening. Actually talk, without the whole philosophical lecture about fairness. I'm open to that, I said. As long as talking doesn't mean undoing the boundaries we agreed on. She wrinkled her nose. You really like that word. It's accurate. She sighed and stood. Well, I don't like it, but I'll try. I didn't stop her as she grabbed her keys and left, but I noticed something. She hesitated at the door. Half a second, as if she was waiting for an old version of me to say something soft, something reassuring, something that would give her back the control she felt slipping. When it didn't come, she walked out faster than necessary. The clarity I'd been feeling lately stayed with me as I headed to work. It didn't feel vengeful or smug. It felt logical, like the world had finally stopped spinning at an angle. At the office, though, the first sign of trouble arrived before I even stepped into my cubicle. My coworker Vaughn waved me over with an expression that never meant anything good. He closed the door behind us in the small conference room and leaned against the table. You and Corbin all right? He asked. Corbin, my once friend, now part-time accountant, part-time opportunist, who'd gradually shifted allegiance to whatever benefited him socially. What about him? I asked. He's been talking, Vaughn said. About you and Talia. About problems. I felt a familiar spark behind my ribs, not anger exactly, more like a slow, steady ignition of awareness. What did he say? That you've been unstable lately, that you're acting unpredictable, that you've been snapping at her. Interesting, I said calmly. Apparently she confided in him, Vaughn added, in a tone that clearly meant he didn't buy it. But then again, Corbin always did like being the center of things. He's trying to position himself, I said. He likes to be useful to whoever has the most influence. Vaughn exhaled. Well, word's spreading. I nodded once. Thanks for telling me. He hesitated. You good? I'm better than I've been in years. That answer made him lift a brow, but he didn't push. By lunch, the news had reached me through 3 separate paths: one colleague, one email chain, and one suspiciously casual comment from my supervisor. The implication was the same. I was the unstable one, not the overwhelmed wife who barked commands like a tired executive directing interns. It didn't take a detective to figure out where the source was. Around 3, I left work and headed to a downtown event venue, one of those upscale warehouse conversions that architects like me secretly enjoy critiquing. My sister Lynn was hosting an open house tour for a high-end client. I wasn't invited, but that didn't matter. She saw me the moment I walked in, forcing her smile to freeze mid-presentation. Her cheeks tightened slightly, but she kept going until the client wandered off to the kitchen area. Then she snapped her eyes toward me. "What are you doing here?" she whispered sharply. "We need to talk." "Not now," she said through clenched teeth. "I'm with a client." "Exactly," I said. She stared at me like she couldn't tell whether I was serious or simply incompetent enough to show up unannounced. "This isn't the time." I stepped aside just enough to avoid blocking the view of her carefully staged living room. "You've been telling people I'm unstable." Her eyelashes fluttered in that defensive way she had when she was deciding whether to play innocent or offended. "I haven't said anything inaccurate." "I'm setting healthy limits," I said. "That's not instability." She scoffed. "Well, the way Talia described it." "Ah," I said. "So you're repeating her version without checking the facts." "She's worried." "She's losing control," I corrected. "That's not fair," she hissed. "It's accurate." Before she could retaliate, the client returned, asking about the fireplace. Lynn plastered a smile back on, but I saw the cracks. Real ones, not the superficial ones she manufactured whenever she needed sympathy. As she walked the client outside to show the patio, I waited near the kitchen. When she returned, she looked furious. "You embarrassed me," she said under her breath. "You embarrassed yourself," I said. "All I did was show up." "You ruined the flow of the presentation. That client is extremely important." "Then maybe don't gossip about things you don't understand." Her jaw worked. "You're making everything harder for everyone." Maybe everyone relied too much on the version of me who never pushed back. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You think you can come in here and lecture me? In front of a client?" "I didn't lecture you," I said calmly. "I asked a question. You reacted." Her nostrils flared slightly, a sign she was teetering between indignation and something more fragile. "Leave," she finally said. "Gladly." But as I turned to go, she reached out to grab the papers I'd tucked under my arm, building notes I'd brought purely to drop off later, not realizing how symbolically useful they'd become. She moved fast, trying to yank them away, but I pulled back before she could wrench them. She lost her balance for a split second, not enough to topple, just enough to bump into the decorative console table behind her. A ceramic bowl rattled dangerously before she caught it. Her gasp was sharp and loud, and the client, who had re-entered just behind her, stared at her with surprise. "You all right?" the client asked. Lynn straightened so quickly she nearly knocked the table again. Yes, of course, just slipped." I didn't say a word. Her reputation didn't need my help unraveling. On the drive home, I replayed the scene. Not with satisfaction, though there was a certain poetic flavor to it, but with clarity. Lynn's instinct hadn't been to talk, to question, or to understand. It had been to control, to seize, to dominate the narrative. Just like Talia. People who rely on convenience often panic when convenience disappears. When I walked into the house, Talia was sitting on the couch with her laptop open and a notebook on her lap. Her posture was rigid, her hair slightly frizzed from running her hands through it too many times. "You were supposed to help me with the presentation revisions," she said, not looking up. "You didn't ask." "I didn't think I needed to." "You do," I said lightly, hanging up my jacket. "Communication matters." She snapped the laptop shut. Are you trying to drive me out of my mind? No, I said. I'm trying to let you take charge of your own tasks. That's not what marriage is. No, I said. That's what ours became. She stood abruptly. I talked to Corbin today. Of course you did. Her eyes narrowed. He's worried about you. I don't need him to be worried about me. Well, someone should be. I turned toward her slowly. Are you suggesting I'm incapable? I'm suggesting you're not yourself, she said. You're being cold, and unpredictable, and spiteful. I'm being firm. It feels spiteful. That's because you're used to me bending. Her throat tightened. So, you want me to admit I've been unfair? Admitting something is only useful if you change afterward. She sank onto the couch again, rubbing her temples with both hands. I feel like everything is collapsing. That's because you're losing the version of me that carried everything. Her hands stilled. She looked up slowly. Is that how you see yourself? As someone who carried everything? Yes, I said. Because I did. Her face twisted, not in anger this time, but in something closer to realization. I didn't mean to put everything on you, she said quietly. Intentions don't erase patterns. And you're just angry because I didn't see it. I'm not angry, I said. I'm done pretending I don't mind. She fell silent. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she whispered, I don't know how to fix this. You start by doing what's yours, and not adding to what's mine. Another silence. This one landed heavier. Not cruelly, just honestly. She finally stood and walked toward the stairs, pausing halfway. Corbin said you're shutting people out. Corbin says whatever gets him attention. She hesitated. He cares. He cares about positioning himself, I said. Not about me. She didn't argue. She just swallowed hard and continued upstairs. When the door closed, I sat on the couch and let everything settle into a pattern I finally understood. It wasn't just Talia, or Lynn, or Joel. It was the entire ecosystem I'd built around myself, one where people relied on me because they knew I'd always say yes. But now that I was saying no, they were noticing the imbalance for the first time. A buzzing sound pulled me from my thoughts. My phone lit up with a new message. From Corbin. Heard you made a scene at your sister's open house. This isn't like you. You need to slow down. I stared at the message for a long second. A long, steady breath filled my lungs. Then I typed back, Stop inserting yourself into my marriage and my family. You're not the authority you think you are. His reply came instantly. Wow. So this is the new you? The hostile version? Talia was right. I set the phone down without replying. The next message pinged, but I didn't look. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself, to explain, to restore harmony. I didn't need their approval. I needed balance. And balance was already shifting. Later that night, while making tea, I caught my reflection in the microwave door, subtle, faint, warped, but recognizable. I didn't look harder or sharper or angrier. I looked clearer, like someone who'd finally realized he wasn't the supporting character in his own life. When I walked upstairs to the guest room, I passed the closed bedroom door and heard nothing inside, not crying, not pacing, not frustration, just silence. A silence that suggested Talia was finally realizing what I had understood days ago. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't a mood. This wasn't a moment. This was a turning point. One she couldn't undo by guilt or sweetness or nostalgia. One I didn't intend to retreat from. The clarity stayed with me as I lay down. Not warm, not cold, just solid, consistent. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet in the house felt honest. Not peaceful, but honest. The morning of the hearing arrived with a strange clarity that almost felt surreal. I woke before the alarm again, not out of habit, but because the tension in the air was tangible. thick enough to press lightly against my chest, a reminder that today wasn't like other days. Today was the culmination of weeks, maybe months, of careful observation, quiet strategy, and deliberate patience. I brewed coffee slowly, savoring the simple rhythm of pouring, stirring, and tasting. The aroma filled the kitchen, grounding me in the familiar routines that had once been overlooked in the chaos of Talia's expectations. Talia moved through the house with a practiced air of calm, but I could see the subtle signs of strain, the tightening of her jaw, the slight flicker in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. Her carefully polished image, the one she carried into every room like armor, was showing cracks. She glanced at the kitchen counter, then at me, and her lips pressed together before she offered a faint, forced smile. "I thought you'd want to go over some points before we leave," she said, holding her briefcase like a shield. Her voice was measured, deliberate, but the undercurrent of anxiety was unmistakable. "I reviewed everything last night," I said, sipping coffee. "We're ready." Her eyes narrowed. "You sound calm." "I am," I said evenly. "Focused. That's different from calm." She exhaled slowly, a sound that carried years of frustration and disbelief. "I don't understand how you do it, how you manage to stay centered when everything feels like it's falling apart around us." "I don't feel like it's falling apart," I said. "Not anymore. I finally understand what's mine and what's yours. Today is just a matter of clarification." She stared at me a long moment, then shook her head. "You've changed." "Yes," I said. "I have." We drove to the courthouse in silence. The streets were quiet, the city still yawning from early hours, and it gave the drive a strange sense of detachment from everything else, like the world outside didn't exist except as background. Talia's hands gripped her briefcase tightly in her lap. Every so often she glanced at me, as if trying to gauge my mood, as if expecting me to falter or react in a way she could manipulate. But there was no falter, no reaction, except deliberate calm. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade cold and imposing. I parked the car and took a moment to survey the entrance. People moved past with their own agendas, oblivious to the tension contained in a single car waiting in the lot. The world would continue spinning, indifferent to the struggles of a single household. That thought alone made me feel grounded. I could influence my corner of it. The rest was irrelevant. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of polished wood and cleaning chemicals. Talia walked beside me, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She tried to match my pace, but her posture betrayed her unease, slightly hunched shoulders, hands twitching at the edges of her briefcase, a careful, nervous energy that radiated outward. We entered the courtroom and were met with the familiar smells of varnish, paper, and something faintly metallic. The room was arranged with the judge's bench at the front, the gallery behind, and tables for the parties in between. I had been here before, but never under circumstances like this. This wasn't about routine hearings or procedural matters. This was the culmination of everything Talia and I had been maneuvering through, the culmination of boundaries, accounts, documentation, and truth. We set up our materials on the table, each stack of documents representing months of careful observation, receipts, spreadsheets, emails, therapy notes, and detailed accounts of the patterns that had gone unrecognized for years. Talia's papers were similarly stacked, but I could see the difference immediately. Her notes were scattered, emotionally charged, and focused on isolated incidents rather than patterns. Her strategy, if it could be called that, relied on emotion rather than fact. The proceedings began, and I felt an unexpected calm as the judge called us to order. Talia opened with a confident tone, presenting her side, her voice firm but tinged with defensiveness. I listened without interruption, noting every phrase, every implication, every subtle shift in the room as she laid out her claims. She was attempting to portray herself as a wronged party, a victim of inattentive partnership, but her evidence lacked cohesion. Her narrative jumped from one incident to another, isolated grievances that could not support the pattern she implied. When my turn came, I spoke with measured precision. I outlined the documentation we had compiled, the shared expenses that had been quietly absorbed by me for years, the patterns of expectation and control that had shifted responsibility entirely onto my shoulders, and the careful records of each instance where boundaries had been tested or crossed. I maintained a calm tone throughout, emphasizing facts over emotion, logic over sentiment. Each document, each note, was presented clearly, without exaggeration or dramatization. Talia shifted in her seat as I spoke, her expression changing from confidence to something tighter, more tense. I noted it without reaction. My objective wasn't to provoke an emotional response. It was to present the reality, to allow the evidence to speak for itself, and speak it did. I could see the subtle ripple in the courtroom as the patterns became clear to those listening. What had once been a jumble of grievances now presented as a coherent narrative, a series of logical steps that demonstrated consistent disregard for equitable partnership. The judge nodded occasionally, marking notes, reviewing documents, maintaining a neutral demeanor that nonetheless carried the weight of authority. Talia attempted to interject at several points, but I remained composed, answering only when addressed, each response precise and factual. Her objections, though frequent, lacked substance. They were reactionary, emotional, unanchored. I answered calmly, reiterating facts, pointing to documented patterns, and highlighting discrepancies between perception and reality. At one point, she rose from her seat, attempting to emphasize a particular point with hand gestures. Her papers shifted in disarray, a stack tumbling slightly to the floor before she caught it. A soft, almost imperceptible gasp escaped her lips, and a few eyes in the gallery flicked in our direction. She steadied herself quickly, but the moment had landed, a subtle crack in her presentation, unnoticed by her but observed by others. I continued, moving through the evidence methodically. Each page, each note, each screenshot painted a consistent picture. Months of verbal demands, tasks assigned without discussion, financial responsibility assumed unilaterally, emotional pressure applied subtly but consistently, all of it documented, organized, and presented with clarity. By the time I concluded, the courtroom felt unusually still, not tense in a dramatic sense, but focused, attentive, receptive. The presentation had stripped away the layers of argument that relied on perception, leaving only the tangible, observable reality. Talia sat back down, her hands clasped tightly, her lips pressed together. The calm she had maintained at the start of the day was fraying, just slightly, just enough that it was noticeable if one paid attention. The judge reviewed the materials carefully, flipping through pages, scanning notes, and listening to both sides. It was clear that the documentation I presented carried weight. Every fact was corroborated by tangible evidence, and every pattern of inequity was traceable and logical. The narrative Talia had attempted to construct crumbled under scrutiny, not through theatrics or confrontation, but through the quiet power of careful preparation. When the judge spoke, the tone was firm, measured, impartial. Each point was addressed, each claim weighed against the evidence. Talia's isolated grievances were noted but found insufficient to counter the consistent pattern I had established. The decision, while procedural in delivery, carried the inevitable weight of consequence. Talia's shoulders slumped slightly. The facade she had maintained, the polished performance she had relied upon for years, was faltering. She attempted a final objection, but the judge's response was calm, logical, and final. The room seemed to contract around her, not with aggression, but with the subtle force of truth. Outside the courtroom, the air was crisp and slightly cool. Talia walked a step behind me, her posture tight, restrained. The quiet hum of the city seemed distant compared to the realizations settling between us. She had underestimated the clarity that careful documentation could bring, the quiet power of a methodical approach, and the inevitable exposure of long-standing patterns. As we reached the car, she turned toward me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might speak, argue, or attempt some last effort at control. Instead, she simply exhaled, a sound that carried years of accumulated tension, and got in the passenger seat without a word. I started the engine, feeling the steady rhythm of the vehicle beneath me. The drive home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was not anxious, not expectant. It was reflective, necessary, a pause to absorb the gravity of the day and the changes it had confirmed. By the time we arrived home, the sun had shifted low in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway. Talia remained quiet, her gaze fixed outside the window. I parked, cut the engine, and sat for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle. We stepped inside together, but apart. She moved to the kitchen, organizing the mail, flipping through the day's correspondence with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. I remained in the living room, reviewing notes, confirming details, and reflecting on the process that had brought us to this point. The house felt different now, not in its structure or furnishings, but in the balance of presence and absence, action and reaction, responsibility and accountability. Talia finally spoke, her voice low, measured, careful. I didn't expect it to go that way. Go which way? I asked. That way. With the judge, with everything. I didn't think it would be so clear. It's always clearer when facts speak for themselves, I said. She nodded slowly, as if considering the truth of that statement. The tension that had lingered for weeks, the pressure, the friction, the subtle contests of control, had shifted. The structures we had maintained, both overt and covert, were rearranged. I moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street, the fading light reflecting off the pavement. The day had ended decisively, logically, and yet not without consequence. Talia's posture had changed subtly, her movements more tentative, a recognition of the limits of her prior strategies settling in. When I turned back toward her, I could see the reflection of reality settling in her expression, a mixture of acknowledgement, hesitation, and the beginnings of comprehension. No grand gestures, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet aftermath of clarity. We spent the rest of the evening in subdued activity, each of us attending to our own space, aware of the shifts that had occurred but allowing them to integrate slowly, naturally. The silence between us was not strained. It was a measured pause, a moment of absorption, and an acknowledgement that the structures of our interactions had fundamentally changed. By the time the night settled fully, Talia had retreated to her office, her movements deliberate but contained, and I returned to the guest room, organizing my notes and reflecting on the precision and patience that had brought the day to its conclusion. There was no celebration, no triumphal display, only the quiet satisfaction of order restored, boundaries enforced, and truth laid bare. In the stillness, I allowed myself a final thought. Control, when exercised deliberately and with clarity, has a far more lasting impact than chaos or confrontation. And today, every carefully documented detail, every measured response, and every patient observation had confirmed that principle with irrefutable clarity. The next steps would unfold naturally, guided by the consequences that had been established, and the balance we had redefined would shape the interactions to come. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of stability, not victory in a dramatic sense, not triumph over another person, but the satisfaction of seeing fairness and accountability take root. The quiet of the house enveloped me, carrying the weight of consequences, reflection, and the inevitability of change. And in that quiet, I understood the depth of what had been achieved, the scope of responsibility assumed, and the path forward, grounded firmly in reality and clarity. The morning sunlight crept across the living room floor in long, thin lines, cutting through the calm with a quiet sharpness. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the street awaken slowly, the way it always did, unaware of the storm that had settled inside our home. Talia's office was silent behind me, her movements minimal, deliberate. She was there but not really present, the air around her thick with unspoken tension. I thought back to the courthouse, the way the judge had reviewed every document, every note, every recorded instance of her expectations and demands. The weight of months of observation, meticulously logged and arranged, had finally settled into clarity. Facts over emotion, patterns over accusations. She had assumed she could manipulate reality through her confidence, her charm, her meticulous insistence on control. Today, she faced the evidence of her own consistency, one she hadn't been ready to confront. When she finally emerged from her office, she was careful, her movements restrained, her gaze avoiding mine. I didn't make a move to greet her. That pause mattered more than any words could convey. She had spent so long defining the rhythm of our household, shaping it to her convenience, that my silence was an unfamiliar territory. It required recalibration. "You're quiet," she said finally, her voice careful, measured. "I'm observing," I replied. "You've spent years constructing narratives. Today the patterns speak for themselves." Her brow furrowed. "I know what you're doing. You're deliberate." "Yes," I said evenly. "And the results are evident. Not just for me, but for everyone involved." Her lips parted, as if she was searching for a counter-argument, but no words came. I could see the realization dawn slowly in her eyes, the understanding that for once, control was no longer solely hers to exercise. That notion alone seemed to unnerve her. Later that day, I attended a meeting at my architectural firm. The projects, the revisions, the client discussions, I approached them with a clarity and precision that I hadn't felt in years. Removing the constant distraction of household expectations and emotional labor allowed me to operate fully. Each decision was deliberate, each proposal clear, concise, and assertive. My colleagues noticed. Vaughn, passing by mid-morning, gave a faint nod, half surprise, half acknowledgement. He didn't speak, but the recognition in his eyes said enough. During the midday break, my phone buzzed. A message from Corbin, terse and clipped. "We need to talk. This isn't how you usually operate." I didn't reply. Let him stew in the discomfort of observation rather than engagement. Attention-seeking behavior was far less effective against someone who had detached their sense of responsibility from other people's manipulations. By the time I returned home, the street was bathed in golden light, the kind that softens edges and tempers intensity. Talia was in the living room, attempting to organize papers from the courthouse, her movements precise but constrained. The careful control she had wielded for years seemed diminished under the weight of unavoidable accountability. "Everything will need to be reorganized," she said, almost to herself. "Or," I said, "you can let the facts speak without adding drama." Her gaze shot toward me, sharp but cautious. "You're insufferable," she said quietly. "Perhaps," I said, "but accurate." The statement hung between us, a quiet challenge and a clear boundary simultaneously. She exhaled, a small sound that was more frustration than surrender. Later, I organized the spreadsheets again, reviewing documentation, confirming details, and preparing for the inevitable follow-up discussions. Each record, each note, each carefully catalogued interaction told the story without embellishment. For months, her actions had been predictable, and for the first time, they were fully visible. Talia came into the room, her hands folded, attempting calm and control. "We need to discuss how to handle the repayment of the accounts," she said. "Yes," I replied. "We'll follow what's been documented, Transparency is the key. She paused. It's not just money. It's everything. The way things have been. I know, I said. That's why clarity matters. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and she sat across from me, careful not to breach any invisible boundary I had maintained. There was tension in her posture, a restrained energy as if she were bracing for impact even though the impact had already passed. The afternoon passed in a mixture of quiet activity and strategic observation. Talia attempted to manage the documents, organize correspondence, and reconcile records, but I noticed the hesitation in her movements, the slight tremor of uncertainty that accompanied each decision. She had operated for years with the expectation that her judgment alone would guide outcomes. Now she was confronted with the tangible, unalterable consequences of patterns she had established but never accounted for. I observed it all without interference. Each misstep, each minor hesitation, each adjustment she made under scrutiny added to the broader pattern, not for amusement, not for vindictiveness, but for acknowledgement of the reality she had chosen to overlook for so long. By late afternoon, I decided it was time to address Corbin and Joel. Both had been quietly observing, attempting to maintain neutrality while benefiting from proximity to Talia's influence. I arranged a meeting at my firm, framing it as a discussion about professional responsibilities and personal boundaries. Both arrived, sensing the tension but unsure of the purpose. "Thank you for coming," I said as we settled in the conference room. "There are some matters we need to clarify, about roles, expectations, and patterns that have been allowed to continue unchecked." Their expressions shifted subtly. Corbin's lips pressed together. Joel's posture stiffened. Both sensed that this wasn't about negotiation or opinion. It was about observation, evidence, and accountability. "I've documented months of interactions," I continued, "instances where responsibilities were assumed without discussion, and where influence was exerted outside of agreed-upon roles. This isn't about personal grievance, it's about clarity." Corbin opened his mouth but paused. "You're taking this very seriously," he said cautiously. "Precisely," I replied. "Seriousness is warranted when patterns persist over time without recognition." Joel shifted uncomfortably. "Are we in trouble?" "Not trouble," I said. "Awareness, correction, accountability." They exchanged glances, realization slowly dawning that the dynamics they had relied upon were being recalibrated. For the first time, the ease of prior assumptions, the implicit permission to manipulate, influence, and rely on my accommodation, was no longer operative. We moved through the specifics. Each instance I highlighted was documented, factual, and clear. Miscommunications were exposed not as malicious intent, but as consequences of systemic imbalance. They could argue emotion, try to inject narrative, but the facts remained unmoved. The conversation shifted naturally toward the broader implications. Corbin and Joel began to recognize how their actions, or lack of awareness, had contributed to the imbalance. There was no confrontation, no accusatory tone, only the illumination of patterns. It was subtle but potent. The realization that advantage assumed through my accommodation would no longer exist. When the meeting ended, both left quietly, thoughtful rather than resentful. Their confidence, previously steady, was unsettled by the undeniable clarity of observation. The space I had created through consistent, deliberate boundaries had effectively recalibrated expectations without aggression, without spectacle, but with unambiguous impact. Returning home, I found Talia in the kitchen, attempting to reconcile her remaining financial obligations. She looked up as I entered, a mixture of resignation and caution in her expression. "Everything is aligned with the documentation," I said. "We're following the plan." "Yes," she said. "I see that now." "Do you understand why it's necessary?" I asked. She nodded. "I do, and I accept it." The word hung between us, weighted but unspoken beyond its simple utterance. Acceptance, at last, of the reality she had resisted for years. Not defeat, not submission, but acknowledgement. Evening came, and the house settled into quiet rhythm. Talia moved with careful purpose, reviewing documents, making adjustments, completing tasks previously delegated entirely to me. Each movement was deliberate, measured, an exercise in competence reclaimed and recognized. I observed her from the living room, noting the subtle changes, the hesitancy in decisions, the recognition of boundaries, the deliberate acknowledgement of shared responsibility. It was the culmination of strategic patience, of consistent observation, and of clear, methodical application of facts over assumptions. By the time night fell, she had retreated to her office, the room quiet, except for the faint rustle of paper. I returned to the guest room, organizing my notes once more, reviewing the meticulous documentation that had guided the day. There was no triumphal display, no need for dramatic gestures, only the quiet satisfaction that comes from the restoration of balance and the acknowledgement of truth. Sitting by the window, I watched the city lights reflect faintly on the street below. The world continued, indifferent, but within the walls of our home, clarity had taken root. The equilibrium of responsibility, the boundaries established, and the consequences observed all stood as testament to the work that had been done. Talia's recognition, subdued yet undeniable, confirmed that the patterns of the past had been addressed, and that the equilibrium between us had shifted decisively. For the first time in years, I felt a steady, unshakable calm. Not the calm of avoidance or compromise, but the calm of clarity, deliberate action, and tangible change. The day had ended decisively, without spectacle, without confrontation, and without need for embellishment. Reality had asserted itself quietly but unmistakably, and in that assertion, the structures we had maintained for years were realigned, measured, and undeniably clear. I lay down in the guest room, letting the evening settle around me. The house was silent, not tense, not anxious, only still. Each sound, from the faint hum of the heater to the distant traffic, was absorbed without distraction. My mind, for the first time in months, moved freely, untangled from the demands and expectations that had once dictated every thought, every step, every moment. Tomorrow would bring its own rhythms, its own challenges, but for tonight, the equilibrium we had reestablished through patience, documentation, observation, and deliberate clarity stood firm. And in that firmness, I understood the depth of the work accomplished, balance restored, boundaries respected, and reality acknowledged with precision and consequence. It was a quiet victory, subtle but absolute, and it carried a weight far more meaningful than any dramatic display could have. It was the culmination of patience, strategy, and the steadfast adherence to principle. Tonight the house was calm, the facts stood, and the patterns of the past had been decisively addressed, leaving the foundation of what came next both stable and undeniable.